Oh, hello there. Today we're going to get right into it. Today we are going to be reading A House of Horrors, written by Mildred Darby. You may ask yourself, why do I care? Well, let me tell you. This is based off of Mildred's real first-hand account while living in Leb Castle with an elemental, who published this under her pseudonym Andrew Mary, and this was published in the magazine Belgravia in January of 1898. A House of Horrors. This is a true story of facts that have occurred and that are occurring. I admit at once that my tale is improbable, even impossible, but a number of men and women, many still living, have seen and heard the things I am about to relate. Of course, you may assume that they were all the victims of hysterical delusions, that it is all a matter of auto-telepathic hypnotic suggestion, or any other sonorous collections of syllables you please to string together. But that these things were seen and heard, and are still seen and heard, is indisputable. For myself, I do not fancy I am of a neurotic or have a highly strung imaginative temperament. I am a captain in a native Indian regiment, 32 years of age, sound in wind and limb, and generally grass, which I aim at. So imagine my eyesight is not faulty. I have done a good share of active service and can honestly say I have never felt nervous in my life before the month of November last year. The daylight was beginning to lengthen into twilight as the train slackened and I finally stopped at the little Irish country railway station in Ballykincope. I gathered together my papers, folded my rug round my golf clubs, handing the tall gray-headed porter who opened the carriage door my gun case and portmanteau. "Another bag in the van." "Right, sir." "Will your honor be wanting a car?" he inquired. Now, just to let you know, this is written in an accent, so I'm gonna do my best, but I apologize if it is not that great. Okay. "Where will ye be going to?" "To Kilman Castle," I replied. "Then 'twill be you our captain. Gordon that the castle car is just after coming for. This way, sir." He led me out of the wooden building that did duty for the station offices to where a tall dog cart was waiting, and soon my luggage was stowed away, a wizen little old groom seated beside me, driving the raking 16-hand horse at a good pace. 16-hand horse. So is that 8 horses? 16 divided by 4, 4 horses. 16-hand? "That's a nice traveler," I remarked, nodding in the direction of the horse, and noting the long, easy stride. "He is that same, sir." His sire was stupendous. "Lord Lochton's celebrated American trotter," answered the old man. Then added respectfully, touching his hat, "This will be your first visit to the castle, I think, Captain." The man was right, for it was the first time I had ever been in Ireland. I had now come to see a little cousin of mine who 6 years ago, soon after I had exchanged into an Indian regiment, had made the Green Isle her home, when she married a good-natured, fiery-haired giant of an Irishman named Maurice O'Connell, the present owner of Kilman Castle. The O'Connells. This was the first time since Betty's marriage that I had come home for leave, and one of the waiting letters I found on my arrival in London was from her, ordering me, in her well-remembered style, to pack up my guns, golf clubs, and hunting kit, and to come at once to Kilman, prepared to take up my abode in Ireland. "I've got a delightful Irish girl for you, with delightful dimples and a delightful dot. That last a rarity nowadays in this distressful country, let me tell you. So make up your mind to be ready for the worst," Betty wrote. "But I need no inducements of dimples or dots, for after my long spell in India, the idea of the Green Isle was attraction enough." "You've been with the O'Connells some time, I suppose?" I asked my ancient. It says Jehu, Jehu. He had the air and manners of a confidential servant. With the master and the old man before him, sir, I drove the master to his christening, and I drove him and the mistress home when he first brought her from England, and please God, I'll live to drive them to their funeral yet, for there's years of work in this arum. He spoke in perfect good faith, with tones of the utmost devotion to the master, whose early demise he thus anticipated. I think that's kind of funny. He's like, well, hopefully he dies. Sure, it was great diversions we had at that time, when the master married bonfires and dancing lashings of porther and tasting of potheen all through the night. It took me and the steward all our time to get the gentleman who had taken us up too much safe out of the ring before the family was up the next morning. And you're gonna have to bear with me. There's some dialogue here, but this guy goes away. I'm sorry if this is terrible. Kilman is a very old place, I think. 'Tis that same sort, and none are older around these parts at all. At all. There's been many a bloody battle fought nearby, and for that matter, there's one living now as was hid in the castle when the Ribbon Boys, God rest their souls, were about. You've had wild times enough in Ireland often, I said encouragingly, hoping to get him to talk freely. He needed a little inducing, and continued. That's a fact, sir. 'Tis often I've heard of my grandfather's grandfather and his doings with the wild Captain O'Connell. I can just remind me of my grandfather's telling me the tales. Him an old man, no one knew what age, just as his grandfather told them to himself. There's one story, but belike I'm wearing you with my talk, sir. I reassured him, and smacking his lips with anticipation of the pleasure he felt in thus giving free rein to the loquacity of his race, he started again cheerfully. Well, sir, they do say that the wild Irish had besieged the castle, and were after burning the O'Moore's house up beyond the Knock. The wild captain and his yeomen, he had a troop there, 300 strong, which did more against the Rapparees than all the king's soldiers put together. Was shut up tight in the castle, with 3,000 or 4,000 of the mountain men camped round in the plain. The Maul Gaughlin was commanding the Rapparees, a mighty robber chief he was, and him and the wild captain had many a grudge to be settled within the saints brought them together. Well, within the wild captain heard that the Maul had burnt the O'Moore's house over his head and killed the old man, and more too, taking Miss Diana O'Moore a prisoner. The captain went mad with rage, for by that token he was thinking that the Lily of Ossory, and Miss O'Moore was named, would have made a wife for himself. 'Twas said her father had a power of golden guineas and precious stones he hid up in a big brass pot for a marriage gift for her. We got to get that money. We got to marry this girl. So by this and that, the captain fairly was rail wild, and he rushed to where his yeomen were feasting and cried out aloud, Who will risk his life with me to save the Lily of Ossory? Sorry, I got a little excited there. With a shout you could hear at the sleeve blooms, every man answered him, "'Tis meself will." The wild captain smiled, and they did be saying a dozen Rapparees had better be saving their souls whenever he smiled. "Come then," he says, and the gates were open, and they rode out and fought the Irishers all the day, slaughtering frightful. But though they killed, and though the wild captain's grey horse came home crimson to the saddle flaps, not one sight did they get of the Lily of Ossory before the twilight came on. So they turned sorrowful into the castle. The wild captain ate no mite, but said with his head bent, no one daring to pass the time of day with him. At last he sent for my grandfather's grandfather. "'Tis ye," said he, "will ye come to the gates of hell with me?" "I will that same," says my grandfather's grandfather, "and that's skipping." I Let's skip it. Then get the clothes off 2 of them, carry on, and be quick. So the other, he got 2 set of the mountain men's clothes, and the 2 of them put on and disguised themselves as strollers, beggars, one with pipes and the other with a fiddle. Then they left the castle unbeknownst to anyone but a sentry. "'Tis ye," said the wild captain. "If the Rapparees discover us, we're dead men." "They'll kill us for certain," agrees my grandfather's grandfather. "And more times than not, roast us alive when we're dead first. They'll be apt to be thousands to 1 against us. Or more, Captain, the Lord be praised." "Die, ye can go back now, and not one soul think the worst of ye." "Sure you know I'd die for ye, Captain dear, and if it's hell you're bound for, it's meself will be there first with the door open for your honour." So no more passed between them until they reached the mountains. "It's Irish will spake," whispered the captain, when they saw the light of the Ribble fires. Then they hailed the sentry in Irish, telling him they had escaped the English, and soon both were warm in their hands to the same fire, and eaten from the big pot that hung over. After supper they played and sang Ribble songs in old heathenish Irish tunes, and my grandfather's grandfather said the wild captain made his fiddle spake, whilst himself he put his soul into the bagpipes until the mountain men went wild with delight at the grand tunes of them. "It's to the mall they must play," the Ribbles cried, and soon the 2 was led further up into the mountains, where the mall and 14 of his chieftains sat, and there, right in the middle of the Ribble lot, with her 2 pretty hands and her 2 little feet tied with a coarse bit of rope, lay the Lily of Ossory, safe enough. Then the 2 played and sung to the mall until he grew tired and felt like sleeping. "'Tis well you're here," says the mall. "Ye will play at my wedding tomorrow," and he grinned as he looked at the prisoner. "We will that same, and dance too," cried the wild captain, smiling up in his face. "'Twill be the English will dance," growled the mall, "with no ground under their feet. I'll make hares of them the day." And with this, he told them how 'twas all planned to surprise the castle at the break of day, and how one of the most trusted of the yeomen had agreed to open a door where he would be sentry in exchange for Mr. O'Moore's pot of gold and treasure. "'Tis a fine scam," cried the wild captain, "and worthy of the Malgochlin. But if it's for the break of day, sure, 'tis slape you best be getting, for it's only 5 hours of the dawning now." So they all laid around the fires to sleep, the Mall and the 14 of his chiefs and the 2 beggars round the one fire, and rest of the army a little distance off. The fires died down a bit, and barring a sob or 2 from the Lily of Ossory, nothing stirred or spoke. Then my grandfather's grandfather felt a long knife thrust by his hand, and the wild captain whispered to him, "Split their throats from ear to ear, that they may not cry out. Cut deep." Slowly the 2 of them crept around, pausing at each sleeping Rapparee, and letting his Ribble blood flow out onto the grass. Not one of the 15 as much as turned over. The captain killed 8 in the Mall, and my grandfather's grandfather, he killed the rest. "Be silent, Diana, me darling," whispered the wild captain to the Lily of Ossory. "We've come to save you." With that he cut the ropes that bound her, and telling her to follow him, he crept out of the firelight, she after him, and my grandfather's grandfather last of all. The captain, he knew every foot of the mountains, so did me grandfather's grandfather, and skirting around the Rapparees' camp, they reached the castle in safety. You may be sure, sir, it wasn't long before the captain had his yeomen out, and they attacked the rebels still sleeping in their camp, and slaughtered 1,000 or more before the sun was up. "But what became of the treacherous sentry?" I asked. "Sure, he danced in the air at the wild captain's wedding with Miss O'Moore." And what became of the pot of treasure? Sure, the captain, he took that with his lady, and they do say... Well? It's only country talk, your honour. But they do say the crock of gold's buried somewhere in or near the castle. You see, it fell out this way. The wild captain and the English king didn't agree about some little matter. 'Twas about someone called a pretender, I believe, and the English king sent the redcoats to besiege the castle. Now the castle had a long underground passage between it and a rath on the hill nearby. In this rath, all the cattle and base were kept and driven down the passage when they were wanted. Well, the redcoats dug and found the passage and stopped it up with big rocks and such like. So they, in the castle, had near a bit or sup for 3 days. Then the wild captain in the night, he called 2 serving men and says he to them, "Help me carry this old crock of butter." But when he called the crock of butter, was the big brass pot full of gold jewels. 'Twas as much as 3 could carry, and they struggled. So when they got to the ship pot the wild captain had chosen, they dug a hole and buried it. Then they all 3 went together to the top of the castle and looked at the English lights below them. "Fergus," says the wild captain to the one of the serving men, "go down and bring me my sword from my room. 'Tis meself will test it afore tomorrow's battle." So Fergus, he went. Then the wild captain, he says to the other, "Kiernan, do you remember where we hid the old crock of butter?" "I do, O'Connell," says Kiernan. "'Twas there, and there we put the gold." "May your soul rest with it," says the captain. And with that, he knocked him over the edge of the battlements and onto his skull on the top of the English redcoats on the stones below. Damn, he threw him over the cliff. When Fergus brought up the sword, the wild captain made pretense of trying the edge with his finger. "Are ye sure you sharpened it well?" says he. "I am," answered Fergus. "Then may it send your soul to paradise this minute." And with that, he chops off the head of him and throws him over the walls too. Then the wild captain, rather than die like a rat in a hole, gave himself up, and they took him to Dublin and condemned him along with Sir William O'Brien, a grand gentleman living 7 miles beyond, to be hung, drawn, and quartered for treason. What an ignominious ending for the Captain O'Connell, I observed. "Oh, they did not hang him, sir. The king was frightened when all was said and done, so both gentlemen were pardoned. But they had put such heavy irons on the captain's legs that he never could walk again, and he died anyway, not clear in his mind. When he lay dying, he told the story of the gold to ease his soul, but no one could ever find the place he meant. Though they dug and dug, but it's just a story. There, sir, now we can see the castle," pointing out with his whip to a grey square tower showing over the tops of the leafless trees. Kilman Castle was a sombre-looking bare building consisting of a square keep tapering slightly to the top, looking in its grim grey strength as if it could defy time itself. Flanking it on each side were wings of more modern buildings, and beyond, one wing was a curious, rambling-looking house, which my driver told me was called the priest's house, and which evidently at one time had been quite apart from the castle, though now part and parcel of the house, being connected by one of the wings. Even the trees around seemed to grow in gaunt, weird shapes, probably because their tops caught the full blast of the wind and their branches creaked and groaned above our heads as we passed under their overhanging shadows. The gateway was castellated and overgrown with liches and creepers, and the drive bordered with ancient walls. Beyond them, the ruins of other old walls or buildings, all overgrown and covered with moss and ferns. Even the topmost branches of the big sycamores were decorated with these same ferns, which grew in endless profusion in every nick and corner. 'Twill be a wild night, my driver remarked, pointing to the murky red sky showing through the trees. As he spoke, a loud, mournful cry sounded above us and was repeated 3 times. That's what I imagine it would sound like. I started at the first cry and then laughed at myself, for I quickly recognized the noise not to be the call of the hoot owl. Often enough I had heard these birds in India and seen my native servants cower panic-stricken, for in the East the cry of an owl is regarded as a token of coming to death to one of its hearers. That's a loud-voiced customer, I said, laughing. Are there many of his feather around here? No, Captain, we never had, but that one of screeching kind. He was here all the summer, and now the winter do be coming on. He's spoiling the trade of little Shebian Biant at the crossroads by the same token. I don't know what I just said. How on earth can an owl spoil the trade of a public house? 'Tis the mountain men mostly sore, goes there and near. A mother's son of them will put foot outside their cabins after dark, since that gentleman in the ivy has been hootin'. The mountain fellers be rail scared, for they do be believin' in pishrogues and such like. Pishrogues are fairy spells, and they do be sayin' 'tis an evil spirit being mean for a soul that will die nearby. There have been a power o' wakes lately, what with the influenzy and the old folks been pinched with the cold in a gold hour it be spoken. Here we are, sir. A bright light shone through the open door, and in the warmth, welcome that Betty and her good man gave me, I forgot the bleak night, the hooting owl, and the traditions the voluble Milson groom had been telling me. The interior of Kilman Castle is quite in keeping with its weather-worn outer walls. I may as well describe it now, though it was not until the next morning that I went over the place with Maurice O'Connell. The entrance hall is very lofty, with a gallery running round 3 sides, and is paved with black and white stones. The walls are pierced, evidently long after they were originally built, by archways leading into the 2 wings, and are 20 feet thick. 20 feet thick. They are honeycombed with narrow passages, and at 2 corners of the tower are circular stone staircases, fine bits of rough-hewn masonry, each wedge-shaped step resting on its fellows. Both staircases are as perfect as the day they were built. It was curious to me to note how the inner axles of these winding ladder-like stairs have had the blackened stones polished smooth and bright by the many generations of hands that have pressed against them as their owners ran up and down these primitive ways. O'Connell told me that tradition states that the castle was originally built by the Irish for the Danes, who seem to have extracted forced labor from the half-clad barbarians before Ireland was fully Christianized. The story whispered by the country folk declares that the mortar used in its construction was made in a great measure with human blood and hair, and that therefore it had withstood the ravages of time. Somewhere about the year 800, the Irish, under the leadership of a chieftain named O'Connell, rose against their oppressors and took possession of the castle, where O'Connell established himself and soon became a powerful prince. His descendants inhabited this castle, whether the original building or a more modern one built of the materials and on the site of the old one, history does not reveal. And until the advent of the English in the 15th and 16th centuries, this stronghold was considered impregnable. Amongst the first of the English adventurers was a young squire, son of an English knight, who hoped to win his spurs at the expense of the wild Irish. The expedition he was attached to, attracted by the rumor of the O'Connells' riches, besieged the castle, and in a sortie the defenders made the young squire was taken prisoner. He was confined in a little room off one of the staircases, And as all the Irish were very busy defending the castle, the only daughter of the house, one Finu... Oh gosh, her name. Finuegola. Wow, what a name. Finuegola O'Connell was deputed to push what food they allowed to the prisoner through a little hole in the walls of his dungeon. The Englishman made the best of his opportunity, and by judiciously tender speeches, he succeeded in winning the maiden so completely to his side that one day, with a view of abetting his escape, she procured the key of the prison and let him out. As he was running down the twisting staircase, he met young O'Connell, the girl's only brother, coming up, who immediately raised a hue and cry. The escaping prisoner turned and fled upward, eventually coming out onto the battlements of the tower. Seeing that flight any other way was impossible, and preferring the risk of sudden death to the more lingering one his attempted escape would ensure him, were he to be recaptured, he gave a mighty jump over the parapet and managed to find refuge, and not death, in the branches of a yew tree growing near the walls, reaching his countrymen safely. Eventually, his rather treacherous lover betrayed the castle to the English. Its inhabitants were all hung in a field called, to this day, the Hangman's Field. And the English squire married Finuegola, taking her name and the lands of her father by right of marriage and conquest. Their son, Maurice O'Connell, was one of the first high sheriffs appointed in Ireland, and his tomb, dated 1601, is still to be seen in the little churchyard near Kilman. The tower had originally 5 floors or stories. Of these, 3 exist. The first, a big bricked upper room under the present hall, then the hall itself, and at the top of the tower a large chapel with a fine east window and stone altar. Besides the bricked up room under the hall are dungeons hollowed out of the rock itself, with no windows or communication to the outer air, and some of which O'Connell now used as wine cellars. In a corner of the chapel is an oubliette, where disagreeable strangers were invited to walk down 2 steps onto a hinged platform that let them fall below the level of the deepest dungeon, where pointed stakes helped to give them a quick journey to the netherworld. Bye, bitch. A couple of cartloads of old bones and bone dust were cleared out of that, my host told me, and buried with due ceremony in the churchyard by some superstitious old ancestor of mine. Amongst others who were said to have been thrown down, there was a priest, the brother of a far-back O'Connell, who offended the reigning head of the family by beginning mass here one day without him. That particular prince was a beauty. One of his little games was getting 150 mercenaries to help him fight the English, and when the enemy were beaten off to avoid paying his hired friends, he treated them all to a poisoned feast in the hall here, and killed the whole lot. See these skulls and a bit of bones? They came out of the wall when we made a new window. The idea is that when this place was besieged, the garrison had no way of burying their dead, so they cemented the bodies up in the walls. That's one explanation. The other is the penny plain, 2p colored, walled up, alive business. You can pay your money and take your choice. Here, anyhow, are the skulls and bones that came out of the wall. I don't trouble my head how they got in there. This rambling description will, I hope, give some idea of the environment of this story and form the outlines of a mental picture of the quaint old place, which had been inhabited without a break for at least 1,000 years. As for the legends and the stories belonging to it, their name is legion, all telling of love, murder, and rapine, as such medieval traditions are always wont to run. My first evening at Kilman passed very quickly and pleasantly. Betty and I yarned over old times, and then she got out her banjo, and we sang reminiscent they say the N-word, which I don't agree, and I didn't know that. Blah, 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 ditties appropriate to that unmusical instrument in the same dear old discordant style that we had sung them years ago. People were very ignorant in the Victorian era. We know this. And I don't agree with it. Okay. Oh, Kenneth, do you remember the night before you sailed when we sang Love to Nancy? Said Betty idly, strumming the catchy air she mentioned. I remember it, growled Maurice, a smile lurking under his mustache. Enough to make any man laugh to see a set of sane people with eyes like boiled gooseberries from crying and nearly speechless from the excessive sentiment of a banjo song. But look here, Betty. Kenneth had no sleep last night, so we must pack him off early tonight. It's getting late, 11:30. There go the dogs. As he spoke, the baying of many dogs, of high and low degree, broke into a noisy chorus, rising to a crescendo of angry fear, and then dying down into a pianissimo of canine woe. The big deerhound Oscar, who was lying on a sheepskin rug in the hall, added a long, deep note of misery to the general orchestra. Do these dogs see the moon? I asked. What a curious note they make. There isn't a moon tonight, O'Connell answered. But the dogs here always do that. It's one of their little ways that won't bear explaining. They mark 11:30 without fail. We can set the clocks by them. Probably some shadow in the trees at that time, I hazarded. So I thought, and we shifted them to the other side of the place, but it was just the same over there. No, don't ask Betty about it, or she'll keep you up all night telling some cock and bull story if you do. Now, once more, will you go to bed, Betty? Think of that poor devil of a maid waiting up there for you all this time. Have a whiskey and soda, Gordon, before turning in. Whilst we were consuming the wine of the country, I asked O'Connell if he knew of any ghost story connected with the castle. He looked at me curiously with his mustache, and then he laughed. A ghost? We've only a couple dozen or more, my dear fellow, but surely you're not the cut of spooky believer. Don't tell me you take a Julia or such like familiar about with you. It was my turn to laugh now. My host continued. I've been here all my life, often quite alone, and never have I seen what I can't quite explain to myself by natural cases. Electricity, and all that. Of course, there are noises enough, but what old house is free from them? It's only rats in a great measure. What I say is that the only spirits about arise from the too liberal consumption of this spirit. He tapped the Tantalus stand. The servants get drinking. We've an old cock now who'd see under the table, but her omelets covered a multitude of sins. Swear they see ghosts, and clear off in a body next day. If anything makes me really mad, it's the rot people talk about spirits and apparitions in this house. What says Betty to all these things? Of course, she is much too hard-headed to listen to such folly, isn't she? Of all the women in the world, one would swear that of her, and yet he pulled angrily at his pipe and enveloped himself in a cloud of smoke. She got some idiotic maggot in her brain last year and has turned ever since as nervous as a cat. It's too bad of her. I did think she had some common sense, and that was why I married her. This with the sublime disregard of any sentimentality common to the Benedicts of some years. Standing. Just now, she has been worrying my life out, trying to get me to go away for this month. It is in November. Most of these mysterious follies are said to appear, because the nights are dark, I expect. Now Betty would die sooner than go upstairs or be left alone at night. It's too provoking of her. I wish you'd chaff her into common sense again. Betty afraid of ghosts? Betty nervous? I did not believe it for a minute. She was certainly playing some deep-laid practical joke upon her husband, I mutely determined to be wary of turnip-hedged boogies and booby traps, for Betty occasionally had fits of such childish follies. We went up the broad oaken staircase in one of the wings, and then along the gallery overlooking the hall. A funny little doorway in the wall about the height of my shoulders raised my curiosity. Maurice O'Connell, taking advantage of his 6 feet and odd inches, pulled it open and showed me the winding, narrow staircase it concealed. A rush of cold air nearly put our lights out, and he hastily pushed the door to, which seemed very heavy. "It's all iron-plated," he explained. "In the rebellion of '98, the family, and in fact all the Protestants of the neighborhood, took refuge in there. However, I won't be telling you the legends. Betty is the best hand. I say, if she does not know an appropriate story, she invents one on the spot." With this parting libel on poor Betty's veracity, he showed me my room, and after seeing I had everything I needed, he departed. My room was a long, narrow one, with a fireplace across one corner. The floor was of polished poplar with a couple of rugs on it. To my delight, I saw that instead of the ordinary heavy-curtained bedstead one would picture as appropriate to the house, there was one of modern make, with a wire-wove mattress. I locked my door as a precautionary measure against boogies or practical joking, and began leisurely to divest myself of my clothes. Then I became conscious of someone breathing heavily somewhere in the room. "Hello?" I thought. "Here is a hospitable spook manifesting at once for the credit of the house." Then the O'Connells' remarks about the servant and whiskey came back to me. Horrors! If it was the bibulous cook, watching me change. The breathing was now snoring, and came unmistakably from under the bed. Seizing the poker, I gave a vicious sweep under the bed, abjuring the snorer to come out at once. There was a patter of feet, and out crept an obese and aged fox terrier of the feminine persuasion, showing her few remaining teeth in an apologetic grin, and agitating her minimum of tail with cringing affability. As the old lady seemed an amiable specimen of her race, and apparently had been recently washed with carbolic soap, I determined to allow her to be my guest for the night, even if she was self-invited. So I threw her my rug, which she proceeded to make into a bed for herself in a corner near the fireplace, scratching and turning around, and finally, with a grunt of satisfaction, curling into a ball, watching my toilet operations with brazen effrontery and wagging her tail whenever she caught my eye. So the toilet must have been like in there. This is the olden days. I placed a box of matches and a candle by my bedside, and it was not long before we were both asleep. My last recollection being the sound of the dog's stertorous breathing, and then a blissful, dreamless unconsciousness came over me. A cold nose against my cheek, and 2 long-nailed forepaws vigorously scratching to get into my bed awakened me quite suddenly, and I found my friend the fox terrier standing on my chest, trembling most violently and whining in a distressed fashion. "You ungrateful little brute," I said angrily, giving her a far from gentle push onto the floor. But in a second she was up again, doing her best to get under the bedclothes. "Not if I know it," and again I sent her flying. What an asshole. The room was quite dark, and as the fire had been pretty bright when I went to bed, I guessed I had been sleeping some time. Thoroughly enraged, when the dog jumped up for the 3rd time, I threw her roughly down, and this time I heard her patter under the bed and creep to the farthest corner, where she sat trembling so violently that she shook my bed. By this time I was thoroughly awake, and fearing I had hurt the dog, I put my hand out of the bed, snapping my fingers to collar and make my amend. "Come on." my hand was suddenly taken into the grasp of another hand. A soft, cool hand at a temperature perceptibly below my own flesh. Oh, hell no. To say that I was astonished would be but mildly convey my feelings. After a few seconds of steady pressure, the other hand let go, and almost simultaneously I heard a heavy, sliding fall, like the collapse of a large body at the foot of my bed. Then the absolute stillness of the room. There sounded a deep human groan and some half-articulated words. Holy Jesus. The voice, if it could be called a voice, died away into another groan. The dog under my bed gave a sharp, hoarse bark and scratched and tore at the wainscoting. Fully convinced that someone in trouble of some sort had gotten access to my room, by what method I could not imagine, I struck a match and lit my candle, springing from the bed and crying out, "Oh, who's there? Oh, what is it?" My eyes blinked for a little at the sudden light, but when they were steady, I looked at the spot where I had heard the groan, but there was no one. The room was absolutely empty, and exactly as I had left it on going to bed. Nothing was out of order, nothing was moved, and there was nothing I could see to account for the noises I had heard. To make certain, I tried the door. It was still locked. I made a tour of inspection round the walls, which were painted, not papered, looked under all the furniture, and finally, kneeling at the foot of the bed, held my candle so as to be able to look underneath. In the corner crouched the fox terrier, but there was nothing else. The polished boards reflected the light of my candle, and perfectly mystified, I was getting up when I felt the hand I had been resting on the floor was damp. I held it close to the light and saw my fingertips and the ball of my thumb were reddened, as if with blood. And turning back the rug, I discovered a dark stain extending perhaps for 2 feet one way and 3 or 4 feet the other. Instinctively, I looked at the ceiling, but its whitewashed surface showed no corresponding mark. Nothing had dropped from above. The stain was damp, not wet, and yet felt warm as though the fluid, whatever it was, had been recently spilled. I examined my fingertips again. The marks were very like blood. Bah! I dabbed my hand in the water in my basin rather hurriedly. Then I once more went carefully round the room. The shutters were barred. The door was locked. There was no cupboard in the wall, and the chimney was still hot from the fire. I tapped the walls carefully and could find no indication of any hollow place that might possibly be like a secret door. But as I did so, my common sense revolted at my own folly. They were so innocent of any panelings or dadoos that could conceal an exit. If a practical joke had been played upon me, where had the delinquent vanished to? One hypothesis alone was possible, that I indignantly rejected, for I knew I was wide awake in my sober sense and not the victim of delusion or waking nightmare. For a minute I contemplated writing the whole thing down there and then, but the absurdity of the matter flashed across my mind. I looked at my watch and found it was nearly 3 o'clock. Devil's hour. It was better to warm my shivering limbs in bed than chill myself further by writing what no one would believe, for after all I had seen nothing. And who would credit groans and whispered words without one particular corroborative evidence? The fox terrier's mark to the important document would not enhance its value in the eyes of the Psychical Research Society or incredulous Mr. Steed. So I crept back to my nest, first enticing the little dog from her corner, and in a half-acknowledged wish for company, even though it was only that of a beast, I took her into bed with me. I left the candle burning for a short time, and then, as there was no further noises, I put it out and prepared once more to woo the drowsy god, and falling asleep was not disturbed again. When I had finished dressing the next morning, I, curious to see what was there, turned back the rug at the foot of the bed. Sure enough, I found the dark stain, just as I had seen it in the night, with this difference. It was no longer wet, but appeared to be of long standing. We were to shoot some home coverts that day, and besides ourselves, O'Connell expected 6 guns, neighbors some, and a sprinkling of officers from the nearest garrison. Betty, too, took me on one side and told me that her friend of the Dimples and Dot was coming, and that I was to be sure and not let dear Captain Adair monopolize the young woman's attention, but that I was to go in and win. Miss Dimples arrived, also dear Captain Adair, a tall, dark ruffian who had basely forestalled me by getting the pretty little lady in question to drive him out. Good tactic. Found this warrior was a universal favorite, O'Connell declaring that he was one of the few decent soldiers he knew, whilst Betty, well, Betty was sickening. Adair and I were told off to a warm corner, where to my great joy I wiped his eye over a woodcock. He grasped 2 long tails that I missed in an unaccountable manner, to be sure, but everyone knows one woodcock is more value than many pheasants. Suck on that. We had a capital day's sport, plenty of walking, and a most varied, if not very big bang, as there were birds of all feathers about. As for the rabbits, the whole place walked with them. As one of the keepers said, they were indeed a fright. Betty and the dimpled damsel lunched with us and followed the guns in the afternoon. Miss Dimples would have none of me, but tripped gaily after the all-conquering Captain Adair, so Betty took pity on me. He must not have been a looker. Or he sucked. Did you sleep all right? Really, Kenneth? Last night? Betty asked me anxiously as we walked along together. Don't you think it likely? I answered, looking hard at her. Of course I did, all the same. But if it is convenient, may I be moved into a room facing west? My present quarters face east, and I never sleep really well that way. I knew as I uttered the words that the excuse sounded thin and forced. It did not deceive Betty for an instant. Then you did see something, she said in a low voice with a deep sigh. Not a thing, I answered cheerfully. Don't try to humbug me, Kenneth. I know you so well that it is impossible. Honest Injun, Betty, never once little ghosty on a postie did I behold. Ghosty on a postie? I think that needs to be like a new phrase. I spoke laughingly. The night was far off still. But to be strictly truthful, I did think I heard a groan or two, and I thought it probably was only my fancy. I would much rather not hear them again. By the way, is there any story connected with that room? Anything to do with the stain on the floor? I saw her color under my watchful eyes. Maurice said nothing to you about it then? I shook my head. Well, people have complained before. In fact, we don't generally put anyone in there now. The room is called the Muckle, or murder hole room. And the story goes that the stain on the floor is the blood of a man stabbed there by his brother. 2 O'Connells quarreled over the ownership of the castle and fought, and the dying brother cursed the other, praying that no eldest son should inherit direct from his father. Maurice succeeded his father, and even he had an elder brother. I believe the curse has always been fulfilled. The room has been disused for 50 years or more when we did it up. The stain has been planned off the board several times, but it always comes again. Creeps up from below in a few hours. No one knows how. Maurice won't believe any of these stories, having heard them all the days of his life. He declares that one person tells another, and then, nervous to begin with, of course, they imagine a ghost. So when you were coming, he insisted on you being put in there, for he said you could not be prejudiced by any nonsense, and that we would be able to prove what a folly it all was. I do not know that I altogether appreciated O'Connell's kind experiment at my expense. However, I laughed and told Betty he was quite right, as no better man could be chosen to lay the ghosts. "I'll have you moved tonight," Betty continued. "Don't tell me what you saw." I made a movement of protest, or heard, for Kenneth, don't laugh at me. But though I hate myself for my folly, I am often more nervous than I can say. "You nervous, Betty? You who got that knife away from the mad girl when her nurses were afraid to go into the room? You who—" She interrupted me quickly. "That's all different. I can't explain it. The only description that at all comes near the feeling is somewhere in the Bible where it speaks of one's heart becoming water. I never felt the least fear, for when I came here, though, of course, I heard all kinds of stories and have had all through endless trouble with servants leaving at a moment's notice, frightened into fits. When people staying here said they saw things, I only laughed and declared it was mere nonsense, and though we've always had quite unexplainable noises, such as the great chains of the front door being banged up the staircase, and along the gallery, and endless footsteps and sightings and cries and rustlings and taps, they never frightened me. Even when sudden lights and tongues of flame and letters of fire on the walls came many times, both of us saw them, for Maurice did see them. He saw them too, though he hates to own it. I was only curious and annoyed because I could not explain it satisfactorily to myself. But Kenneth, a year ago, last November, I saw it. And I have never felt the same about these things since, or ever shall again. November is the height of the season in your spook society? I asked lightly, trying to cheer poor, serious Betty. Yes, nearly all the stories are about that month, though odd spirits appear all through the year. It's in November that there is said to be the vision of a dead troop soldiers drilling in the ring. What are your stock apparitions? Oh, there's so many, I don't remember them always, but I will try and recall what I've been seen within the last 6 years. First, of course, there's a banshee. You're gonna have to excuse me going in and out of an accent. I don't know what's going on. She sits on the terrace and keens for coming deaths in the family. Then there's Earl Desmond's ghost, who howls in a chimney where he was hiding and got smothered. A monk with tonsure and cowl walks in at one window and out at another in the priest's house. That is the wing beyond the blue room where I sleep now. He's been seen by 3 people to my own knowledge, not servants, for of course their stories are endless and require more than a grain of salt. And then a little old man with green cutaway coat, knee breeches, stockings, and bright shoe buckles, holding a leathern bag in his hand. Quite a dozen people have seen him. Sometimes he's all alone, and sometimes a little old woman to match him is there, with skinny hands, long black mitts, old-fashioned dress, and a big headdress, so they describe her. My mother saw them, and a third figure, an old man dressed like a priest, with an intensely cunning face. She saw all 3 together several times. Do these ghosts do any harm, or talk to you, or anything like that? The green old man tries to stop people, but no one has been brave enough to interview him yet. Then in the priest's house comes a burly man in rough clothes, like a peasant. He pushes a heavy barrel up the back stairs of that wing near the servants' bedrooms, and when just at the top, the barrel rolls down, bump, 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 a fearful noise, and all disappear. I fear I laughed heartily at this inconquest ghost, but Betty went on, unmoved. Then There's a woman with very few clothes and a red cloth over her face. She screams loudly twice and disappears. That is on the same landing as the barrowman. These have been seen by numberless servants, and, my dearest Betty, do you mean to say you believe old wives' tales told by the common or garden domestic? Garden domestic? What is that? No, I don't, said Betty candidly. I don't mind about these one bit, I tell you, because I'm trying to give you a full catalogue of all who have been said to appear in my married life here. Go on, my dear. Then, resumes Betty, there is a tall, dark woman on the historical rustling silk dress. She haunts any room where there are children and sobs at the foot of their beds. My last nurse and 2 or 3 maids have seen her. Her story is that she was a poor soul one of the O'Connells had kidnapped, and that she had an infant son after she was brought into the castle, which O'Connell threatened to kill if she would not marry him. And when she had yielded to him, he piked the child before her eyes, saying she could not look after him and the baby at the same time. They found her hanging the next day, having killed herself. What nice, cheerful little ways the O'Connells seem to have had. They were simply robber chieftains, and robbed and murdered without compunction, said Betty. Then there is a scene on the gallery, seen once in my day and several times in past generations. Sometime in the back ages there was a beautiful girl, the daughter of a squirean, that 2 of the O'Connell men were attached to. Both tried to abduct her, one successfully. The other, returning angrily and disappointed to the castle, found the girl was already within its walls. A violent quarrel ensued between the 2 men, in the middle of which the girl escaped from the room in which they all 3 were, and ran shrieking along the gallery. "Let him who catches her keep her," shouted one man, as they both started in pursuit. The original abductor caught her first, and with a cry of triumph lifted her in his arms. "Keep her then," cried the other, but as he spoke, he ran his dagger twice through her back, ka-cha, and killed her. The whole scene is reenacted in the gallery. Betty related this pleasing legend with much spirit. "Oh, Betty," I cried, "do say there is a blue light. That story is nothing without a blue light." "I don't know if the light is blue," she answered simply, "but the keep is lighted up with this apparition when it's seen for a minute. When the girl is stabbed, everything disappears. I've seen the keep light up myself once." "How? When? And where?" "Driving home from a day's hunting at the other end of the country, 2 girls were staying here, and myself. We were very late, and it was so dark I had to walk the horse up the avenue. When within sight of the castle, I could see the yellow light of the lamps shining through the cracks of the shutters in the wing and from the hall. Of course, as it always is, the rest of the tower was in darkness. Quite suddenly, there was a brilliant stream of white light from all the windows and arrow slips in the keep, from the big chapel windows at all. I had just time to exclaim, 'Oh, look at the light,' when it went out just as suddenly. 'Someone taking a look round the place with a torch or something?' I hazarded. 'No one would venture up to the winding stairs to the chapel at that hour, I can tell you. Besides, I know no earthly light but electricity could produce that strong glare I saw.' 'A sudden flash of lightning, probably.' 'There was no thunder or sign of any. However, I never expect anyone to believe it. I saw it, and that is enough for me.' 'You tried to find out an explanation?' 'Of course I did,' replied Betty half crossly. 'Do you think I like that kind of thing happening in a place I am to live in for the rest of my natural life, and my children after me? There, Kenneth, I don't mean to snap at you." She smiled penitently. "When people talk as they thought you went out of your way to invent the very things that make life a burden, I do get annoyed. I never tell people these stories now because they simply don't believe me, or if they do, write one down in a weak-minded, self-deceptive, backboneless idiot. Betty, you know that you are Kenneth and are not people, But to hark back to the ghost inventory, there is something heavy that lies on people's beds and snores, and they feel the weight of a great body pressing against them, but they see nothing. No one, to my knowledge, has seen this, only heard and felt it. Then there is something that very young children and dogs and cats can see, but no one else. Fortunately, as the children grow out of babyhood, they seem to lose the power of seeing this thing. My babies have seen it when too young to talk and were sent precious nearly into convulsions. My cats go cracked, split, claw, and run up the curtains, and the dogs, it was only a day or two before you came that Maurice and I were in the smoking room with 4 or 5 dogs when, without rhyme or reason, they all dashed into the hall, barking furiously. Then, just as quick as they dashed back again, their coats bristling, their tails tucked between their legs, the picture of fright, old Oscar as bad as any of them. Maurice ran out, but could see nothing uncanny. But no amount of driving or coaxing would bring them out again. They crawled under chairs and sofas, shivering. Could your husband make it out? Not a bit, but that often happens. Those are all the ghosts I can remember in the house, except it. But outside they swarm, and I am not surprised, for the whole neighborhood was a veritable Armageddon. We cannot plow anywhere near without turning up skulls galore. Why don't you let the place to the psychical research people, I suggested. With such a delightful assortment of ghosts on tap, they would be charmed to take it. I only wish Maurice would, said Betty, or let someone come here and investigate. But like all Irish men, he adores every stone and blade of grass that belongs to him, and he won't hear of the place being uncanny in any way. Once a friend wanted to send a parson with a book, bell and candle, to lay a ghost she saw, and Maurice was furious. And when I suggested inviting a man I know who is very clever at probing into these kinds of things, he would not hear of it. He gets so angry with the country folk when they refuse to come here after nightfall, and when they say the place is dark, meaning bad. As for me, he thinks I'm rapidly becoming fit for the nearest lunatic asylum because I'm in such deadly terror of ever seeing it again. Would you mind telling me what you saw yourself, Betty? O'Connell told me you had a fright. I'll tell you, if you like, Kenneth. But of course you will find some plausible and utterly impossible natural explanation for it. Maurice said vaguely it was after dinner, which is extra rude, for I am and always have been strictly blue ribbon. Still, here are the facts. I had a party for shooting here last November, amongst others, my sister Grace and one of my brothers, Ted, you know. Well, we had tramped with the men all day, so we turned up to go to bed early. I went round one of the girls' rooms, then got into my dressing gown and had my hair brushed, and after that I sent my maid off to bed. Maurice and I were the only inhabitants of the Red Wing, next the room you slept in last night. No one else that side of the tower. I heard a noise in the hall, so went out to the landing and along the gallery, and looked over. There I saw Maurice putting out the lamps himself. He had a lighted candle in his hand and was eventually coming up to bed. Maurice, I called to him, will you bring me the last review of reviews out to the drawing room, please? I want to read an article in it. All right, he called back. I'm just coming up to bed. He left one lamp burning and went into the drawing room, whilst I, leaning my elbow on the corner of the gallery balustrade, waited for Maurice to reappear. I recollect I was wondering what kind of sport I should have the next day when I was going to hunt with the kilogram hounds. Suddenly, 2 hands were laid on my shoulders. I turned around sharply and saw, as clearly as I see you now, a grey thing standing a couple feet from me, with its bent arms raised as if it was cursing me. I can't describe in words how utterly awful the thing was, and it is very undefinableness, rendering that horrible shadow more gruesome. Human in shape, a little shorter than I am. I could just make out the shade of great eyes and sharp features, but the whole figure, head, face, hands, and all was grey, unclean, bluish grey, something of the colour, an appearance of common cotton wool, but so sinister, repulsive, and devilish. My tongue stuck to the roof of my mouth, and I felt every hair on my head separate and move. Then the spell was broken. I wheeled round, fortunately outwards onto the open gallery, and with something, not myself, in my throat that shrieked continuously, I tore along the passage, down the stairs, through the corridor, into the priest's house, where my sister was sleeping. Once in her room, I nearly fainted, but pulling myself together, I managed to make my husband and brother, who hearing these shrieks had flown to the rescue, understand that there was a thing in the gallery which frightened me. They ran up together and searched carefully. But though they hunted up and down, they saw nothing. Betty paused and pressed her hands to her heart for a minute, and then resumed. I soon got all right, though my teeth would not stop chattering for a half hour, and I told them quietly what I had seen. Maurice was dreadfully frightened at the time. Now he declares that I was hysterical and that a cat jumped on my back. Betty had grown quite white as she related her adventure, but managed to smile at the word hysterical. It must have been a trick, Betty. Who could have played it on me, or who would be in that part of the house? I grant you, it is plausible some unknown enemy conceived the excellent plan of trying to frighten my few remaining wits away, but it's not very probable. And I, who saw it, but what's the good of talking? I should like to explain it to my own satisfaction, but I still can't. One thing I know, if I meet it again, I shall go stark, staring mad that minute. So as I have no ambitions for Bedlam, I take every precaution to prevent such a fate overtaking me, and I have forsaken that wing of the house, leaving those rooms for strong-minded people like you. Also, I make my maid sit in my room now until Maurice goes to his dressing room. There, Kenneth, I have told you, and doubtless you think me an infinite fool, but oh, Kenneth, if you had only seen it. Be assured, Betty, if I do, I will put a .240 revolver bullet into cotton wool and make the funny jokers inside sorry for themselves. That's all. Our talk drifted into other channels, and by the time the gathering twilight sent us indoors to tea and hot cakes, I was no longer thinking of the galaxy of ghosts that Betty had trotted out for my benefit. Betty and the admirable Captain Adair sat after tea on the fender stool in front of the cheerful turf fire, gossiping lazily, so Miss Dimples had perforce, in default of the better game, to pay a little attention to me, and by the time the dressing gong sounded, we were discussing mutual affinities, having reached this interesting conversational point by the chromatic scale of dancing, hunting, shooting, plays, books, religious beliefs. Miss Dimples would have been an aggressive agnostic had she known how. First impressions, telepathy, palmistry. Miss Dimples told my fortune, making an amusing record founded upon the romances of a well-known military novel writer. Thence to affinities. We agreed that the topic was not properly threshed out and should be continued in our next. I had been shifted. I found on going up to dress into a room next to the murder hole chamber and thought my new, bright, big quarters a distinctive improvement. The floor was carpeted and looked respectable, comfortable, and not suggestive of blood and murders. I looked forward to a real sound sleep that night. We spent a merry evening. Captain Adair, who was staying the night, sang us comic songs until we ached with laughter, and Miss Dimples, smiling and fascinating, complimented my subjection. Alas, I am not the owner, or even likely to be, of those dimples and that dot. We went out in a body to catch the 11:30 ghosts and to time the dogs. When we first neared the kennels, there was a great deal of pleased sniffing and whining from the dogs, but to the second correct, the wild howling began. None of us could see what started the chorus, so that mystery remained unsolved, though we each tried our best to find plausible theories. After more songs came whiskey. When the ladies had gone to bed, shouting choruses is apt to make one thirsty. Then we turned upstairs to our respective rooms, my little friend, the fox terrier, whose name I found to be Nell, accompanying me again. Tired out with a long tramp and sleepy from the extra glass of whiskey those thirsty songs were answerable for, I knew nothing from the time my head was on the pillow until the servant brought my bath water the next morning. So he got to sleep. And that's chapter 1. Miss Dimples was a laggard at breakfast. Betty was just going in search of her when the door opened and she came in. Her pretty rosy cheeks had lost their color, and she looked quite pale and tired, as if she had not slept. "What have you been doing?" O'Connell asked, with much severity. "Reading a trashy modern novel in bed, young lady? Or, like that sensible wife of mine, interviewing a ghost?" No one could accuse Miss Dimples of being pale now. She flushed painfully, a vivid scarlet. Betty looked at her with troubled eyes, and O'Connell, seeing the effect of his jesting words, frowned rather wrathfully. I threw myself into the breach, talking fast and loud to my host as to the day's prospects. When O'Connell, taking Adair with him, had departed after breakfast to consult with his steward, a ubiquitous treasure whose duties ranged between buying the baby's boots and arranging the various shoots, Miss Dimples, with many more blushes, broke the sad fact to her hostess that she was recalled home. I was sorry for the poor child, for she was in agony, between inventing a specious lie and not seeming in unseemly haste to quit her friend's roof. "I'm so sorry to go, dear Madam O'Connell," she said, with the telltale flaming cheeks, "but I got a letter from Mother this morning saying she is not very well, and that she wants me to come home." Betty did not believe this story, nor did I, but as a very strong motive was evidently behind the girl's many excuses, I resolved to try and extract the truth. It was arranged that Miss Dimples should depart after lunch, and Betty, jiggling a huge bunch of keys in a workman-like fashion, started housekeeping, telling her friend to amuse me for half an hour. "You've been telling terrible taradiddles, Miss Dimples," I said, reprovingly, when we were alone, shaking a reproachful finger at the fair center. "You never had any letter this morning, but a very obvious bill forwarded on to you. I particularly noted the blue envelope lying in solitary grandeur on your plate." "If you did notice, you shouldn't have. And yes, you are horribly rude to tell me to my face I tell stories. Those are Indian manners, I presume. Now, dear Captain Adair." These people are so racist. Miss Dimples pouted a provokingly charming manner at me. "We are not talking of Captain Adair. I should say, bless him," I interrupted astutely, "but are discussing the infamous conduct of a little lady who, having told several very inartistic fibs within the last 5 minutes by the clock, now refuses to confess and receive absolution. Certainly I refuse, with such a father-confessor. You will not find him more sympathetic in all Ireland, including its garrison towns." An alarming glare from 2 heavily curtained eyes made me hasten to add, "See, I am quite in the right attitude." I sank on my knees with my hands clasped. "Now, fair lady, in your mercy, tell me, your devoted knight, what wicked monster disturbed your rest, that I may rend it from limb to limb." "I wish you could," she answered with a frightened glance round. Then, in more natural tones, do get up. Don't be so silly. What would the O'Connells think if he came in? And don't be so silly. People might imagine I was laying my heart at your feet. Shall I? My shooting boots might hurt that valuable article. She placed in evidence an absurd travesty of a broad-soled boot. I could have held the two in one hand. There. The lace is untied. As you are in a convenient position, will you tie it for me, please, Captain Gordon? If I tie it so that it won't come undone again all day, will you tell me? The shooting boot was in my possession, so I was not adverse to parleying with the enemy. Will I tell you what? All about everything. What do you mean? You make me shudder with your sweeping questions. God gracious, no. Then I shall unlace your boot. I began to carry out my threat. You are horrid. Do it up again at once, and when it's quite done, I might begin to think of telling you something. Philandering over a minute, shooting boot is very pleasant, but it was not business in this case, so with a smothered sigh, I repaired the damage and released the hostage, which disappeared to join its fellow under the leather-bound checkerboard skirt Miss Dimples wore as appropriate to sport. Now sit down. No, not here. Over in that chair. Well, first you must swear by your spurs, not to tell the O'Connell. I swear it. Or even in a horrid club smoking. I never enter such parties. My mamma does not like me to. Or ever to tell Madame O'Connell. Mayn't Betty know? Certainly not. It's bad enough. My having to be as rude as I am and flying off like this without my adding insult to injury by telling some stupid story about the house. So be it. I won't tell Betty then. I went up to bed, you know. You gave me my candlestick, by the way. I believe you made my fingers black and blue. She examined critically her plump little digits. Miss Dimples runs to entrancing hollows even in her hands. No, stay where you are. You need not look at it, thank you. Only be more careful next time you hand a person a candlestick. Well, we talked a little and brushed our hair and drank some tea. Do you women drink tea at that hour? Horrible depravity. You men drink whiskey, which is worse. Now, if you interrupt me once again, I shall stop altogether. So there. Well, I went to bed, and as I said before, my room is called the clock room, and it is in the priest's house. I locked my door quite securely, but I could not sleep for ages, not a wink. Though I was dreadfully tired from that awful tramp, and my poor feet. Here the number 2 shooting boots peeled out pathetically to emphasize her remarks. Simply ached. I heard all you men go to bed. A nice noise you made. Then I heard the servants go past, making those elaborate efforts to walk softly that result in twice the noise of ordinary footsteps. Then I tried counting, but that woke me up all the more. And at last I composed 2 new frocks, and the mental effort did make me drowsy, so that when I tried to recollect Dr. Monaghan's last Sunday sermon, I was off in a few seconds. But Miss Dimples, with your religious convictions, do you go to church? Of course I do. One must give what Protestant tenets one has a good example. Besides, I play the organ, and it's such fun composing the voluntaries. You can't think what a beauty something to play with makes. She laughed merrily. Now, don't interrupt me any more, or I truly will stop. Just as I was dozing off, great heavy footsteps come up the stairs, woke me up again. Heavy steps like a big laborer with clod-hopping boots would make. I listened, thinking it was safe as my door was locked, wondering who it could be. The footsteps came along the corridor and stopped at my door for a second, and then came on right into my room as if no door was there at all. I can swear the door never opened, but the footsteps came right on through. It sounds very mad, I know, but it's truly true, Captain Gordon. Those footsteps went right about the room for several minutes, and I nearly died of fright. I kept my eyes tightly closed, afraid I might see something and expire, or worse still, my hair turn white in a single night. However, at last, I could not bear the horrible idea of this thing walking around unhindered, and I got the strength to open first one eye, a teeny weeny bit, and then both. It was quite light in the room, as the turf of my fire had fallen in and was burning brightly. Well, I looked about, but could see nothing. Yet at the time the heavy footsteps went on, across the room to the wardrobe, and then back to the fireplace, the very boards creaking under the weight of nothing that I could see. At last, to my horror, the footsteps came over to the foot of my bed, and the ghost, yes, it must have been a ghost, I'm positively certain, but it sat down plump on the edge of the bed, almost on my toes. It's a great big heavy ghost too. It was so fat, for it made all the springs rattle. Fortunately, the bed in that room is very broad and one of those great spreading hospitable beds, and I was lying away from the ghost with only my feet over to one side, so gradually drawing my toes up. Heaven knows how I had the courage to do that. I crept softly out on the other side and along the floor on my hands and knees into the corner behind my bath. The big felt mat the maid spreads for me to stand on was folded up there, and I wrapped myself up in it, and there I sat all night shivering with cold and fright, whilst that horrible great big pig of a ghost lay on my bed and snored and snorted most comfortably. You may laugh, Captain Gordon. I only hope it will go to you tonight. I did not feel in the least like laughing, I can assure you. When the morning came and it grew light enough to see, I looked over to the bed, fully expecting to see some hideous monster lying there, yet there wasn't a freaking thing. My door was locked just as I had locked it, but on the second pillow, the one I had not used at all, there was an impression of a heavy head, and all along the eider-down quilt there was the mark where the huge long ghost had lain. I would not sleep another hour in this house. No, not for £1,000,000. It's not at all kind of you to laugh at me, Captain Gordon, for I am quite in earnest, and really and truly I was utterly unnerved and never so frightened before in all my life. I did my best to comfort the poor little girl, who evidently enough had really imagined an exceedingly alarming experience, which, whether bred in her own nerves or caused by some spiteful sprite, had succeeded in making her pass a very miserable night. She was quite shaken, and had only just escaped a bad cold as a result of her night out of bed, and was not at all fit for the 14 Irish miles she must drive before she got into her own home. But in vain did I urge her to delay going in until the next day. She was stubbornness itself, and as the very suggestion of spending another night in Kilman seemed to give her pain, I refrained from further pressing and led our conversation to lighter, less nightmarish channels. O'Connell and Adair joined us after a bit, and then Betty, with a cloth cap over her eyes and a light 28 bore in her hands. "I'm one of the guns today," she announced airily. "No, you don't, Betty," replied her husband. "I'm not going to have murder committed on my land, if I can help it. Put the pop gun away if you are coming with us. If you must shoot today, you may go by yourself, not with the rest of us, if I know it." "Oh, Maurice, it's no good, my dear. Didn't you take the toe off my boot a few weeks ago, shooting rabbits out of the oats? The shot did not go within a yard of your boots, you old storyteller. Quite near enough to ruin my nerves for the rest of the day, anyhow. Here, put up that gun like a good girl and help beat today. Betty always thinks if she taps an occasional tree, she's doing wonders. You'd shoot a beater for moral certainty at times are too bad now for me to be able to afford you big game." I've been out a dozen of times, said Betty with an injured air, and wiped your eye before now. I dare say, her husband said dryly. I've had many marvelous escapes, I will own. But since the corn cutting, no thank you. Once bitten, twice shy. Very well, said Betty, resigning her gun. I will beat today, but tomorrow, Kenneth, you and I will go out together alone, and you'll see what sport we will have. If women must shoot, remarked O'Connell, dictatorially, and nowadays they are not happy unless they do everything we do, and lots of things we'd be ashamed to do, and then let them make up their own parties and shoot each other. There are plenty of superfluous women about. Miss Dimples rose immediately to his insulting bait. You men are just jealous, she declared. You know, O'Connell, your wife is a capital shot. Of course, we women do everything better than you men, and in shooting we score because we haven't sat up half the night making our hands shaky with whiskey. What about tea? I began, but a fiercely glance quelled me. I've known some pretty shots amongst ladies, said the diplomatic Captain Adair. My sister's a first-class shot, Betty remarked, much better than I am. How we laugh at her this summer, though. We used to go out with little repeating rifles, stalking rabbits, and at first she would start out with a silk-lined skirt and frou-frou-y petticoats. Then the rabbits could hear rustling a mile off. But plenty of women shoot now, and well, too. There's Lady Gary Owen, who is a champion at woodcock, and Lady East Riding knocks down all before her. And do you remember the American widow at the Chinese town shoot last year, Maurice? She showed you men the way. With a huge cigar forever in her mouth and the tight rationals on, I can just picture you doing it, Betty. O'Connell laughed at the recollection of the transatlantic dame. Well, come along. Here are the others. We must hurry up. The morning sport was as varied and excellent as the shooting of the day before. The pheasants were all wild birds. We only shot the cocks and were mighty strong on the wings, as different from the turned out barn door fowl as possible. We walked over the most different land, bog, covert, marsh, and heather, succeeding each other in pleasant variety. Besides long tails, we massacred a few partridge, plenty of snipe, and a mallard, and a brace or two of grouse, golden plover, and mini woodcock. Also the usual plethora of bunnies. Hares we saw, but O'Connell preserves them strictly for a sporting pack of harers who hunt in the neighborhood. Betty promised me a day with them, and also with the nearest foxhounds, two of the quarry of the later pack breaking out of one covert and stealing, grinning away, not much discomposed by the wild view hallow that followed them. After lunch came a tender parting with Miss Dimples. She was kind enough to express a hope we might meet again, and murmured confronting assurances that she would keep me some dances at a ball coming off within the next 10 days. I never knew if Miss Dimples did keep those dances for me. Anyhow, I fear that lucky beggar Adair got the benefit of them, for events crowded and sent me back across the silver streak long before the ball. Adair left Kilman after dinner that night. He came into my room when I was changing my shooting things and began to chat. What a rummy old place this is, he volunteered. You never were here before, were you? There are no end of the stories going round about ghosts, you know. Not that I believe in such yarns. Do you? You never found a moderately old place people did not say was haunted? And as Kilman is moderately old, of course, they are bound to call it so, I answered, sententiously. Yeah, but sometimes you do hear most unexplainable rows here. Why, only last night, I'd have sworn someone was singing a big cupboard there in this room I was given. Tricks, I should say. I don't know how it was all done. All the same, as I searched the beastly place out several times, but no sooner did I get to bed again that the infernal music began again. It's to be hoped your visitor had a pleasing voice, I laughed at his injured tone. The song, if I could call it a song, was wordless, all jumbles of vowels and sung in succession of minor notes, always ending in a particularly piercing tone that gave me a pain behind my eyes, and made me want to sit up and howl like a dog. I feel sure those poor brutes last night heard the same thing when they yelped. Oh, of course, it's all rot. I dare say I dreamt it. But I thought I'd ask you if you'd dreamt it too. One doesn't like to ask O'Connell about the matter, for he's the best of good chaps, yet he's a bit touchy to that point. I remember once he was very near knocking my head off because I hinted at something being wrong in another room that I was in. I assured Adair I had not had the mysterious minstrels in my room and asked for particulars of his other experiences. Mind you, he began, I don't believe in ghosts, not for a second, yet it is funny, I must own. What happened before? Oh, nothing much. Only every time I got into bed, I was rolled out again. Mind you, I saw nothing, though I looked pretty smartly, I can tell you, with a candle in one hand and a revolver in the other. Only, as I told you, no sooner did I lie down again that the mattress humped itself up and threw me. A bucking mattress is a new and added terror to the history of ghostology. I pulled the bally old bed to bits and at last yanked it all out onto the floor where I slept in a heat. The man who called me thought me quite mad or very drunk. However, I told him I could not sleep any other way and cleared that day. O'Connell would not believe a word of the matter. Of course, he did not tell me so in like so many words, but he laughed and patted me on the back and advised me to have 4 instead of 3 fingers of whiskey next time. And then I would sleep better. Madame O'Connell laughed too, but promised she would never put me in that room again, and never has. Of course, all the talk of spirits is folly, but this is a very rummy place. There's no doubt about that. With this, he left me, and when he had gone, I regretted that I had not asked him if by any chance it was in the room I was in now he had been so rudely disturbed. But my mattress, as I punched it, seemed incapable of any such Buffalo Bill tricks. When Adair had departed after dinner, we talked shooting. I told shikari tales and romanced over the tigers I had nobbled, giving the full account from start to finish of the exciting sport I had had with the late owners of the 2 fine pelts I was giving to Betty. 11:30 came and went, heralded as before by the dogs, but in going over the stories of the past hunts and big shoots, we took no heed of time. It was past 12 when Betty left us, and nearly 1 o'clock before we thought of turning in. O'Connell rang up a servant and asked him if the house was shut up and the household gone to bed. "They have, O'Connell," said the man. "Then you can go too. I will put out the hall lamps," answered his master. "Now, Gordon, we'll have one more drink and then go to bed." We walked into the hall, and O'Connell showed me the old-fashioned locks and heavy chains that barred the doors. I mentally wondering how these chains could be taken from their staples and dragged and rattled upstairs in the way Betty had described. Then he put out the lamps, and with Nell, the fox terrier, at my heels, and a favorite cat of his following him, we walked upstairs. He saw me into my room, gave me a fire poke and made it up, and then, wishing me a good night, walked across the gallery to his dressing room, and I heard him open and shut the door. Left for the night, my first action, as it always is, was to lock my door. Then I put a candle and matches near my bed, and prepared to make my little friend Nell a comfortable corner. The dog and I had grown allies. Betty said she was quite jealous, for Nell was a faithful old lady who did not generally admit new loves into her doggy heart. "It's one of Betty's tests with new people," O'Connell told me. "If Nell does not growl at them, then they are all right. If she does, nothing will persuade Betty that they are not burglars in disguise, and she will have nothing to say to them." I threw my rug down again tonight for Nell, who sat in front of the genial blaze and turned her damp nose up to me in the trustful way the dogs have. Wheeling a low, roomy armchair into a good position for the light of the lamp to fall on my paper, I got my writing book, and with my legs each side of the fireplace began to write some letters, which it was absolutely necessary should leave by the next day's mail. Up to the present, I'd really had no time for writing, but now it was business and it had to be done. My first letter was to a firm of naturalists who were setting up some markhor heads and bighorns for me, telling them to send 2 good specimens and a couple of tiger skins on to Kilman. Next, I wrote to my gun makers about an express rifle I was in treaty for. Pausing only to light my pipe, I can never get my ideas to run straight without the aid of my old briar. I began a long and rather intricate letter to my lawyer about a monetary matter that had been giving me a great deal of bother lately. Stooping to replenish the fire, the one drawback to these delightful turf fires is the constant need there is of putting on fresh sods. I looked down to see where the dog was, for I missed her from my feet. Nell had disappeared. I whistled softly and snapped my fingers. A faint tip, tip, tip of a wagging tail told me her whereabouts. The fox terrier had hidden under an old secretaire in the corner and had no intention of coming out, though I called her repeatedly. "Don't be such a little fool," I said crossly, kneeling down and pulling her out by the scruff of her neck. "You are not going to begin fresh pranks, I trust." Nell's big brown humid eyes looked wistfully into mine, but the moment I relaxed my hold, she attempted to creep back under the secretaire again. However, I prevented her and carried her to the bed I had made for her by the fire. Then I was just settling down to my writing again when a scratching at the door caught my attention. I looked up to listen, my eyes falling on the terrier. She was sitting bolt upright on the rug, every hair of her coat bristling roughly, her lips drawn up, showing her old brown teeth, her ears laid back flat on her skull, her eyes fixed on the door, trembling with the same painful rigors of the night she had first been my companion. The noise at the door continued. At first, I fancied some cat or dog was trying to get in, but then I noticed that the scratches kept up a kind of time. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. I set my teeth. The unknown exponent of the art of practical joking at Kilman had chosen the wrong time for a display of his pranks. He was safer when he kept to the dark of midnight, for when suddenly awakened out of sound sleep in a black Egyptian gloom, one is not so formidable a foe as when a lamp lighted, candles burning, and fire blazing. One catches up a revolver that has often provided its accuracy and goes forth to inflict condemning punishment on the villain or fool attempting to frighten one. Besides, I was really enraged at the dastardly way poor Betty had been tricked, and resolved that if he, she, or it, who were guilty of these disturbances should show, they would regret the hour they tempted their fate. My revolver was soon taken from the holster case in which I carry it about. I assured myself that it was loaded. Then, walking across the room and unlocking the door, I flung it wide open. There was no one outside. The landing and corridor were empty, and beyond, through the half-open door that divided the wing from the tower, I could only see the blackness of the unlit gallery. As I listened, my straining ears seemed to catch the sound of a soft thud, then a rustle, then another soft thud, going along the gallery. But as I could not see, I turned quickly into my room and, catching up the candle from the table at the side of the bed, walked out onto the landing and through the door into the gallery. Holding the candle overhead and striving to pierce the dark depths below and around me. All was still now. Only my own breath broke the silence. I sniffed at the air. Pah! A subtle, unknown, and horribly vile smell filled my nostrils and sent me back, quite sickened, to my room. There was no more to be done, so I shut and locked the door and turned with a sigh to my bothering letters. Nell welcomed my reappearance with rapture and every demonstration of delight. She jumped onto my knees and tried to cover my face with her frenzied kisses. I felt that she was still trembling violently, so I soothed and petted her for a few minutes before putting her back into bed. I'd scarcely taken up my pen again when a noise came from the far end of the gallery. Thuds and brushings. It advanced right up to my door, and whatever caused the noise fell or threw itself, one or twice heavily against my door, making the whole framework shake. And then the scraping began again. 1, 2, slow and long scratches down the panel. 1, 2, 3, shortly and quickly succeeding each other, then a rustling or brushing noise against the door, followed by a thud and more scratching. I sprang up, sending my papers flying in all directions, rushing to the door, unlocking it, and tearing it open. The same sickening smell struck my nostrils. The mat that lay across the threshold was half turned back, but beyond this there was no more to be seen, this time than before. But, most unmistakably, I heard the rustling, brushing, soft dumping noise at the end of the gallery. Should I walk across and rouse O'Connell? That entailed waking Betty, and her being left alone whilst I carried off her husband to help in the hunt for this mysterious night bird who is disturbing me. I was the only occupant. I knew of the Red Wing, the O'Connells alone in the Blue Wing, and in the priest's house were the babies and servants. Should I cross the gallery? I debated. Go through the blue corridor, down the stairs, and into the priest's house in search of the butler? I had no kind of idea which was his room, and my endeavors to discover him might land me in the nurseries with terrified shrieking babies and irate nurses, or in the women's servants' quarters where indignant and hysterical maids would call down vengeance on my devoted head. Even should I succeed in finding the man's room, what should I ask his aid for? A burglar hunt? But burglars do not scratch with their fingernails on people's doors. A ghost hunt? Then I should probably frighten all Betty's domestics into departing the next day, besides laying up endless ridicule for myself when nothing came out of it. How did I know that Oscar, the deerhound, had not been taught the clever trick of scratching and bumping in correct time? There was nothing for it but to go back and wait further developments. I shut the door, but I did not lock it. That's stupid. And put my papers away. All idea of further writing being out of the question. I placed a lamp on a chest of drawers exactly opposite the door. I lighted every candle in the room, and revolver in hand stood by the door, ready to wrench it wide open before the practical joker could have time to depart. The first intimation of the return of my vestiant was as used from Nell, the fox terrier. Again, her coat bristled and her limbs stiffened. The same visible tremor shook her whole body, and her eyes once more fixed themselves, agonized, on the door. In a little, I too heard the bump, bump, bump along the gallery. The rustling and brushing, the thump against the door, a sniff under it, and a long scratch, as if with a sharp fingernail down the paint. Breathless with excitement, I flung back the door. In a moment, I knew what Betty had meant when she said her hair moved, for my flesh all over my body and scalp crept, and every hair on my head stood straight on end. People will scoff at the idea of a grown man in full possession of his physical and mental faculties admitting without reserve that he was utterly, undeniably terror-stricken as I was, and absolutely paralyzed with fright. My hand holding the revolver dropped limply to my side, as in the full glare of the lamp I saw the creature that squatted in the doorway. No one who has not experienced the sensation can, in the smallest measure, understand the absolute weakness that came over me. the seeming cessation, the pulses of life, the grip in heart and brain, and deadly numbness that rendered me incapable of thought, word, or action when I first saw the awful beast. I heard a sharp yell from the terrier just after the door swung back, but after that there was no further sound or movement from the dog, and the creature on the mat and I faced each other in absolute silence. The lamp burned brightly, the fire fizzed and puffed, and my fascinated eyes took in every detail, every gruesome feature of the indescribable horror that squatted at my door. The thing was about the size of a sheep, thin, gaunt, and shadowy in parts. Its face was human, or to be more accurate, inhuman. In its vileness, with large, projecting, opaque, yellow eyes, loose, slobbery lips, and a thick saliva dripping jaw slopping back suddenly into its neck. Nose? It had none. Only spreading cancerous holes. The whole face being one uniform tint of gray, as was the dark, coarse hair that covered its head, neck, and body. Its forearms were thickly coated with the same hair. So were its paws, large, loose, and hand-shaped. And as it sat on its hind legs, one hand or paw was raised, and a claw-like finger was extended, ready to scratch the paint. Look at that, dude. Its lustreless eyes, which seemed half decomposed and looked incredibly foul, stared into mine. And the horrible smell that had before offended my nostrils, only 100 times intensified, came up into my face, filling me with a deadly nausea. I noticed the lower half of the creature was indefinite and seemed semi-transparent. At least I could see the framework of the door that led into the gallery through its body. I cannot tell you exactly how long we thus stood, gazing at each other. Time seemed ceased, and eternity began. But at last the creature gave a species of hop and landed well inside my room. Then my hitherto, nevertheless, fingers closed round my revolver. Oh! The comfort its cold stock gave me, and covering the creature carefully between its prominent eyes, I fired. A crash of lead striking the wood of the large hanging cupboard behind the object I aimed at told me I had either missed or my bullet had gone clean through the thing's head. It did not seem one bit inconvenienced, merely turning its vile countenance at the sound of the splintering wood. I took aim once more, desperately determining that if lead could solve the mystery, my bullet should this time. I could not have missed, but another ping of the bullet into the wardrobe was the only result of the second shot. My flesh crept again, and a stifling tightness clutched my throat. Either my eyesight was failing, or the creature was gradually becoming less distinct. Just as I was preparing for a third shot, it reared itself upright, and holding its arms rather bent, it took one step forward, as if it was about to spring upon me. Was it the trick of my hot, aching eyes or not? I cannot say, but the horrible, bestial lines of the creature gradually merged into the gray, featureless shape Betty had described. Overcoming the strongest physical repugnance at the thought of the creature touching me, I pressed my revolver right up to or into its breast and fired. Springing back to avoid its hands clutching me, my ankle twisted, and I fell, something striking me a sharp, stinging blow on the temple. The next thing I heard was Betty's voice saying joyfully, "He's coming to now, doctor, I am sure." My eyelids seemed weighted, as with lead, But with an effort I opened them to see a man I could not recollect having ever seen before standing over me, with a pair of scissors in one hand and a rock of sticking plaster in the other. Beside him stood Betty, and Maurice was supporting my head. I was lying on a bed in a small room I had not been in before, but which, from the whips and boots about, I guessed rightfully to be O'Connell's dressing room.
"You fell and split your skull open against an iron bedpost, old man," said Maurice. "We got Dr. Chartley out to mend you up."
"Not quite as bad as that, O'Connell," the doctor corrected, smiling. "I expect Captain Gordon has had many a worse head than this. There, that's as neat a job as I can make of it. You'll have to wear your hat well over your eyes to hide that plaster, or your friends will say you've been prize fighting. Want to get up, do you?" "I would not if I were you. It's not much more than 7 yet, so lie where you are until breakfast time and try to get asleep. Here, drink this up."
"Betty,"
I called rather weakly, feeling an insane desire to cry.
"Betty, are you all safe?" "Of course Madame O'Connell is. Why wouldn't she be?" interrupted the doctor. Oops, wrong voice.
"It's ruining her complexion, she is, stopping at a bed like this. Now, O'Connell, please. I'll be much obliged if you and your good lady will leave me alone with my patient. With your permission, I will take a couple of hours' rest in this fine chair, and then invite myself to breakfast with you, for I'm due at your dispensary at 10, so it's not worth while going home." Betty pressed my hand, and they left me alone with the doctor. I was beginning to speak when he stopped me. "Look here, Captain Gordon," he said. "I presume you want to get well fast. Well, then don't be bothering your poor, battered brain with thinking. You've had a fall and a fright. Well, no one else at all was frightened or hurt, and you yourself are not at all bad. If you sleep now, you'll be all well when you wake up."
"Doctor," I cried earnestly, "I must be well enough to get to Dublin tonight. And Madame O'Connell?"
"And Madame O'Connell and himself are to go with you by medical orders," the doctor said, with a comical twist of his face. "I'm hunting the lot of you away from a change, babies and all, so unless you want to be left here all alone with the alternative of Ballykincope Union Infirmary, get to sleep and be fit for the journey." He sat in an armchair, wrapped a rug around his feet, and vouchsafed me no more words. My thoughts were confused and chaotic. But before I could arrange them, the medicine he had given me did its work, and I went to sleep. O'Connell was sitting in the room when I awoke, and a tray with breakfast things was on a table beside my bed. My head was quite clear now. I was free from aches and pains, and very hungry.
"The doctor said you could get up when you'd eaten something, but there's no hurry. Gordon, as our train does not go until 3 o'clock, feeling pretty fit again?"
"I'm so awfully sorry, O'Connell," I began, but he stopped me.
"I know what you mean, old man. It's no fault of yours, I suppose. Look here, though. About last night. It's Betty. I don't want to have to frighten her."
"What happened when I fell? I suppose you heard my shots and came in?"
"You let fly 3 times, didn't you?" "I didn't hear the first shot. Betty did, and awoke me just as the second. I was half across the gallery when you fired the last."
"Then you saw?" He cut me short.
"My dear fellow, I saw nothing.
I make a point of never seeing anything in this house. I simply cannot afford to. It's like this. I must live here and see to things myself. I have nearly 1,000 acres in my own hands, and to farm to a profit needs the master's eye, let me tell you. Then you know, or probably you don't know, that the rents are all cut down 30% by the land courts, and even with that, one has to give reductions to get them paid. Why, if a fellow does not keep his wits about him, the reduced rentals would hardly cover the family charges, to say nothing of the government extortions, tithe, rent, quit rent, and all the rest that must be paid in full. They don't reduce them, mind you, pro rata to the failing rentals they are paid out of. Dozens of poor devils all over Ireland, smaller landlords having no living margin at all. One lad near here with an estate that used to be worth 14,000 a year has to make up his mother's jointure of 2,000 a year, very considerably from money left to him in England, the whole estate not paying its way. The largest landlords are more or less rent controllers for the chargents and the government. So here I must live, if we are to live at all, and provide for our children. Then, to look at the matter in another light, my father, grandfather, and their fathers before them spent their lives here. Deuced long ones, too, judging by my grandfathers. The ghosts were talked of then, just the same, and no one was one bit the worse for them that I ever heard of. My idea is, if you leave them alone, they will leave you. So I have not seen and do not see and never will see one of them. But with Betty, it's different. So Gordon, I want you to help me. Do tell her a good thumping, likely lie, and make her think you were dream. Kenneth can economize that lie, Betty's voice said gently. She had heard her husband's last words as she came into the room. I know what you were talking about, and I know Kenneth was not dreaming. But I don't want to know or hear another word on the subject. We'll stop in Dublin until November is over, and then we'll come here. I'm so sorry, Kenneth, that you have proven to be one of the small percentages who see. Many, many people come here, and they see nothing, and they scoff at the idea of there being anything to see. Now, I'm going to pack up. Don't you get into the other wing again. The clothes you want will be brought to you here, and the rest packed up. Now be a sensible man, and don't go trying to remember all last night, as if there was the smallest danger of my forgetting it. But eat up your breakfast before you move.
Betty's right, said O'Connell. We won't talk of ghosts again. After all, what is the good? It all leads to nothing.
Where is Nell? I asked, suddenly thinking of my little terrier friend.
Oh, she's dead, O'Connell answered shortly, and I needed no more particulars.
Are you fucking kidding me? Are you kidding me? He killed the dog? I had a bad feeling about this. I'm sorry. I don't like stories like this, and I don't plan on telling people stories like this. We're almost through. If ever you tell the story of your experience in Kilman, said Betty, when the train was bearing us all to Dublin, you'll be accused of inventing every word, and people will say that you might have thought of something more probable. I sincerely trust that if you are tempted to pass on Betty's gossip and stories, you won't be bringing my name into it. It's bad enough to be a distressed Irish landlord with a wife who makes ghosts an excuse for trips to town to Dublin at the most inconvenient seasons. It's bad enough to have daughters to provide for and a conservative government doing its level best to ruin you, without having the only roof you can hide your miserable head under dubbed haunted, and in consequence your friends refusing to come near you, or if you do get them into the house making holes in your poor sticks of furniture with a revolver, and then refusing to stay more than 2 days when they promised you a month. I saw Betty in town the other day, and asked her what of the apparitions at Kilman. Just the same, she answered briefly. What will you do about next November? I asked. Sufficient unto the day, was her reply. As I said when I began, I expect nobody to believe this record of facts, that the apparitions are purposeless and not in the least probable, I admit. Yet that they appear in this year of grace, 1897, I most firmly aver, for seeing is believing. And that's it. And my mouth is dry. Ooh. We're just gonna have to have another video to talk about this, because what did you think about it? I'm so sorry. I didn't know that the dog was going to die. I would not have read that. And my posture is so bad from sitting here so long. And I got my mouth is full of cotton. What did you think about it? This is based off of her experience. And the whole crouching in the doorway thing with the nail extended freaked me the F out. Interesting. Interesting. All right, with that, hey, thanks for coming by. Namaste and good night. And don't let it bite. And don't shoot the dog. All right, bye.